Hello, I'm Ethan Nadelmann. I'm honored to have the opportunity to deliver this closing keynote at this conference. And what I want to talk about is how the fight within tobacco control between the forces for and against harm reduction reminds me so much of what I witnessed over my almost 4 decades of engagement with the issue of illicit drug control policy, both as a researcher and as a professor and as an activist. Um, Part of what drew me to the issue of illicit drugs many years ago was that the more I read the evidence, the science, the history about how the policies had come to be what they were, the more I realized that drug control policy should move in one direction towards a public health, human rights, decriminalization approach. But at the same time, and this dates back to the 1980s and 90s, the alternative approach, the war on drugs, was the one that was overly dominant among public opinion, among politicians from across the political spectrum, in the media coverage, in the funding sources, all of that, right? And so many of the challenges that we face now in trying to transform harm reduction from a minority approach into the dominant approach in tobacco control policy were challenges that I and my colleagues and allies faced in years past. Uh, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about some of my experiences. And even if I don't make the connections directly, I think you'll see what they were, right? I mean, by and large, I believe in harm reduction. Harm reduction, the basic approach that starts off with the assumption that drugs are here to stay. There's never been a drug-free society. And ultimately, our objective is not to try to create a drug-free society or even to try to build moats between those drugs and ourselves, those drugs and our kids, but essentially to learn how to live with the fact and reality of these drugs so that they cause the least possible harm and in some cases the greatest possible benefit. That ultimately this involves a balancing test, right? I'm no libertarian, I'm no right-wing libertarian. I believe that government should play a powerful constructive role in pushing people to act in their own self-interest. I'm a huge fan of the book by Castine and Thaler, Nudge. I do believe in using time and place restrictions and limited bans and all sorts of other things in public education in order to get people to do the right thing, including stop smoking cigarettes, stop using other drugs, stop overeating, stop doing things that don't help them and that have at least indirectly broader cost to our society. Now, as I got involved in the trying to challenge the war on drugs in the late 1980s, it really felt like taking on an incredibly powerful force. I mean, it felt the war on drugs back then felt like McCarthyism on steroids, right? The elements of demonization, rejection of scientists, everybody piling on, that in some ways I think dwarfed what we saw happen with the explosion of Juul use among teenagers a few years ago. And then, of course, it was backed by criminal laws in a way that you don't as yet have happen in the area of tobacco control today. So there was a really quite significant thing. And people like me who stepped out and said, wait a second, isn't it possible here that the war on drugs is doing more harm than good? In fact, that the war on drugs approach may be doing more harm than drug use and abuse itself? Well, we were labeled libertarian legalizers, people who just wanted to give drugs to kids, people who didn't give a damn about the consequences of using drugs, which were all false accusations, but were widely said and put out there by politicians, by major media forces, by our opponents, and what have you. Well, I mean, obviously, you can see similar things happening today, and many of the assumptions that underlie what is going on. There was a common assumption across the board that drugs really did present a legitimate public health threat. And that's what we as harm reductionists were focused on. But among our opponents, it wasn't just focused on that, right? For them, there was something else going on. There was the preoccupation about kids that resulted in virtually the entire war on drugs being justified as one great big child protection act. There was a demonization of the enemy, the narco traffickers, easy, or even just low-level drug sellers, easy to demonize, and they were thoroughly demonized at a level in a way that big tobacco is today, or maybe even more so. But there was also a kind of abstinence ideology driving the opposition to harm reduction. And a belief that no use is good, no use is permissible, that there can be no acknowledgement of the pleasurable aspects of using some of these drugs, that there is something actually fundamentally immoral about using these substances. And that drove the war on drugs, just as to some extent it drove the institution of alcohol prohibition in the early part of the 20th century. And it's something that I think we see very much again in the anti-harm reduction movement within tobacco control. Right, where smoking cigarettes with all the horrific harms associated with that is conflated with any use of nicotine in any form other than a patch or a gum, right? And that any notion that people might desire have some benefit from it, that they might even have some right to do this to their bodies, is really just thrown out the window. So I remember when we were advocating for making methadone more easily available and fighting the stigma, and what came back to us was, oh, you're substituting just one drug for another. Oh, if you make this available, then people won't quit. Oh, dependence on methadone is no different than addiction to street heroin. I mean, all of this sorts of things that, when we tried to fight for needle exchange programs, right? The same thing. Oh, junkies will never take action to reduce the risk to themselves. Oh, it sends the wrong message. Oh, it might encourage kids to do. Oh, if you make clean needles available, people will be less likely to quit. Pretending to say it's all about the science, but rejecting the scientific conclusions when they come in. All of these things that we had to deal with then, obviously, you can see the analogies happening today. Same thing with medical marijuana, where there was more and more evidence about the medicinal benefits of cannabis and its ingredients, but widely and dismissed by our opponents in all of this. Now, what I also remember is thinking, well, at least government research agencies should be objective in this thing, and they should make a good faith effort. But it wasn't true. I mean, the more I looked at what was going on in funding, it reminded me, of trying to do honest, interesting drug research in the US. It was a little bit like trying to do honest, interesting social science research in the old Soviet Union. You quickly learned that there were certain questions the authorities didn't want to have asked and certain answers they didn't want to have given. And that if you persisted in that frame, you would become a disfavored person. Your proposals and your papers would be sent to reviewers known to be hostile. You would be less likely to be asked to serve on a grand review committee. The funding priorities of these agencies had nothing to do with looking at the potential negative consequences of the policies themselves, or nothing to do with looking at what might be the positive benefits. National Institute on Drug Abuse, a former director said, hey, we study just abuse, not use. We're only interested in looking for harms, not for non-harms, not for benefits, which of course presents an incredible bias in the types of studies and funding that happens. And then what you saw happen then with researchers in this field was that essentially researchers developed sort of cautionary blinders, political blinders that became ideological blinders, that became intellectual blinders, where they even just stopped even looking and asking all sorts of interesting questions, where all of government funding, and National Institute on Drug Abuse was providing 90% of all the drug abuse research funding in the world, was focused on a very narrow set of questions, where proposals to look at how are these drug control policies possibly doing more harm than good was basically not to be considered, or looking at how foreign approaches might work better in the United States than what we were doing here was just not part of the agenda as well. I was struck by the remarkable underfunding of ethnographic research, the snowball research, whether it's in the overdose area and trying to understand what's going on with fentanyl in recent years. And why aren't we having extensive snowball research to really understand this? And then, of course, I'm looking at the tobacco control area and just stunned when millions of people report that they have, that they have stopped smoking by switching to e-cigarettes or what have you. So little research and understanding how exactly and why that is happening, right? So that type of biases God, I remember, the powerful forces. In 1998, President Clinton had to make a decision whether to allow federal funding for needle exchange. And his drug czar, Barry McCaffrey, presented the arguments No, there's no evidence there. The evidence was overwhelmingly there. National Academy of Science was there, but he said no, no, no. And then Clinton says he was strongly influenced by the head of an anti-drug agency, CASA, Joe Califano, the former hero of taking on big tobacco, but who was an abstinence ideologue when it came to these other drugs and was opposing needle exchange program 15 years after they had already become accepted in Europe. So the conferences, people like me, my allies, just systematically not being invited virtually at all. I looked at the agenda to the conference of PAVE, Parents Against Vaping E-Cigarettes, and there's nobody from a harm reduction perspective. They have a who's who of members of Congress and people from federal agencies, but nobody from a harm reduction perspective. I wonder at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, is it possible that anybody speaking at this conference from a pro-harm reduction perspective could even be tenured, or have the biases become, that intense there? The ways in which evidence is distorted. I remember, a major article showing that MDMA killed large numbers of monkeys in the study, lands up in Science, heavily promoted, right? And you have, the head of the National Center on Drug Abuse showing that this shows that even a single evening's use is playing Russian roulette with your own brain. It turns out the study was flawed. They'd given the subjects, methamphetamine instead of MDMA. Now MDMA is being approved with high safety. FDA is fast tracking it. Just the willingness to accept the most outrageous claims because they didn't fit with the ideology. So all of these things are, of course, happening, right? And the huge amount of biases in funding from government, the ways in which not just conservative politicians, but even liberal politicians, even many of those who are my allies in fighting against the drug war and legalizing marijuana for medicinal other purposes, legalizing harm reduction approaches, have jumped on board the efforts to ban all forms of e-cigarettes and oppose tobacco harm reduction. Now, there is one significant area, though, where what's going on in the anti-harm reduction area is even more pernicious than what we saw happening in the illicit drug area. And that, I think, is really in the ways the character assassination and demonization of legitimate people because they take money, directly or indirectly, from a big tobacco source. I came across recently a letter that the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids orchestrated to the head of American Journal of Public Health, protesting. They had published Derek Yak from the Smoke-Free World and Brad Rotu, a major researcher, for having significant conflicts of interest and are biased. It stands to reason, they said, that they're not seeking to advance a dialogue about public health, but rather act as paid spokesmen with the intent on muddling science in service of the tobacco industry's agenda. That's character assassination. It's dishonest. It's duplicitous. It's not true. I mean, I look at the people doing tobacco harm reduction research today, and they remind me of the brave researchers who were doing harm reduction and needle exchange, approaches in the early days. And I look at guys like Derek Yak and Brad Rodu, or for that matter, Jerry Stimson with his Global Pharma on nicotine. And I see this as highly principled individuals who are effectively my heroes. And they're operating in an environment in which to take even the slightest bit of money from the only source available, oftentimes big tobacco, is regarded as entirely disqualifying, to be disinvited from conferences, banned from journals. But meanwhile, all the philanthropic money, of course, especially the Bloomberg philanthropies, is all driven by a fundamental anti-harm reduction ideology. People are supposed to present conflicts of interest if they take money from any tobacco-related thing. But what about a conflict of interest when you're taking money from somebody who has stated he is ideologically opposed to any harm reduction approach in this area, who has made fundamentally false accusations about the risks of e-cigarettes, right? And who has said he just wants to get rid of them? Should that not be part of the disclosure requirement when people are putting through conflicts of interest? So the risk of the legitimacy of the scientific process by basically the anti-harm reduction forces putting their foot on the scales because they know they can't win the fight in the playground, in the battleground of science, and therefore they need to exclude people based upon their funding sources rather than ask, is this science truly legitimate? That's something we never saw in the illicit drug area. Now, of course, what's so sad about this is that a billion people smoking around the world, 40 million in this country, 500,000 premature deaths here, millions more around the world. And the anti-harm reduction ideology is so fundamentally locked blocked, and non-strategic. If you want a strategic approach to reducing this, you don't pursue policies like opposition to e-cigarettes in ways that then push people back to smoking cigarettes or that help inflate the cigarette companies' profits. You look at ways at which you can manipulate this market and supplies and regulations so that you can encourage people to embrace the harm reduction approaches. When public opinion says that the majority, polls show the majority of people believe that vaping e-cigarettes is as or more dangerous than smoking cigarettes, when a majority believes that nicotine is the principal reason that cigarettes cause cancer. And I believe the polls also show even today that a majority still believe that the E-Valley problem a couple years ago was about e-cigarettes, not about vaping tainted THC cartridges. Well, with that massive amount of misinformation about there, how can you possibly have an honest and constructive and productive tobacco control policy? That needs to be challenged. So finally, let me just say that, um, entering this area, I realized I was entering a community where everybody in tobacco control, both pro and anti-harm reduction, had been thoroughly traumatized by their battle with big tobacco. Big tobacco has been one of the most pernicious forces in the history of capitalism. There's no question about it. And even today, there is no reason to trust them whatsoever. Ultimately, they have to be, responsive to their shareholders, to their investors, et cetera, and they operate in a competitive environment. So the question becomes not how do we keep demonizing them and even character assassination of those associated with them. The question becomes how do we push and manipulate them to act in the interests of public health one way or another? It's that failure to engage strategically in the same way that those people who are anti-drug and pro-drug were failed to engage strategically that needs to be addressed today. I do believe as we ultimately prevailed in many issues of illicit drug policy with the legalization now of marijuana, with legitimization of psychedelics in therapeutic settings, with the acceptance of needle exchange, methadone, and harm reduction, et cetera, with the decriminalization initiatives happening around the country now in the United States, I do believe that harm reduction in tobacco will prevail. And I'm just going to leave you with one final quote because, the key person in all of this is a guy named Mike Bloomberg, who has put vast amounts of money behind funding, not just very good anti-smoking efforts, but very counterproductive anti-vaping efforts. But a few years ago, as he wanted to run for president, he was confronted with his support for stop and frisk policies, overwhelmingly directed at young Black and brown men in New York City, for which there was no evidentiary basis. And Bloomberg said the following: I can't change history. However, today I want you to know that I realized back then I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Over time, I've come to understand something that I long struggled to admit to myself. I got something important wrong. I got something important really wrong. I didn't understand back then the full impact that stops were having on the Black and Latino communities. I was totally focused on saving lives. But as we know, good intentions aren't good enough. I want to believe that one day Mike Bloomberg is going to issue the same sort of statement with respect to his opposition of tobacco harm reduction. That's what he needs to do. Thanks.